Nebraska Territory, May 1873. The train hissed and belched steam into the dry spring air as it ground to a halt at the dusty depot outside Red Rock. A lone woman stepped down onto the platform, her ivory skirts brushing the edge of a worn carpet bag, her gloved hands trembling. She blinked hard against the sunlight, her eyes red, her shoulders set like glass about to shatter. She had waited through the long miles from Ohio, waited through the letter that promised marriage. Waited through the slow crawl of the train across the plains to meet a man who was supposed to be her future, but he was not there. Sybil Prescott stood alone, the crowd thinning. A stiff wind tugged at her veil. She clutched the letter again, crumpled now in her hand. A simple promise from a man named Wallace, clear handwriting, kind words, the vow of a new life on his ranch. He never came, her eyes burned. She turned her back to the tracks and sat on the edge of the wooden platform. The lace at her cuffs had gone limp with sweat. She could not go back. What waited in Ohio was nothing. No family left, no money. She had sold her mother's brooch to buy the train fare. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep the sob inside. A shadow fell over her, the smell of horse leather and dust. "You all right, ma'am?" She looked up. A tall man stood before her, his felt hat in one hand, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. His shirt was sun-bleached, sleeves rolled to the elbow. His eyes were the color of the Platte River in spring, pale gray-blue, steady. Sybil's voice cracked. "He was supposed to be here, Wallace. He sent for me." The cowboy looked down the empty road leading away from the depot, then back to her. "You came all this way, and he left you standin' here." She gave a short nod. That was all she could manage. He crouched beside her. "I am real sorry to hear that." She tried to answer, but the tears pushed through. She turned her head away, ashamed. "My name's Porter Oakley. I have a spread not far from here. Not big, but it's mine. Listen," she looked at him, startled. "I'm not trying to make anything worse. But you should not be sittin' out here with nowhere to go. You need a place to rest tonight. I got a spare room at the house. And if you want, I will take you into town tomorrow, help you find work or a way forward." Sybil stared. "Why would you do that?" His mouth tugged into a line. "Because someone should." Her breath caught. The pain in her chest shifted, not gone but lighter. She nodded slowly. "All right." He stood and extended his hand. "Come on." She hesitated, then placed her fingers into his. His palm was warm and strong, calloused in a way that made her feel steadier just touching it. They walked toward his horse and cart, the wind lifting the hem of her dress as she stepped down from the platform. She did not look back at the depot. The ride to his homestead was long and mostly quiet. Sybil watched the horizon, the way the grass rippled like water, the sky too wide to understand. Porter did not push her to speak. He let the silence sit between them like a warm coat. His home was a modest log house set near a cluster of cottonwoods, with a small barn and corral. 2 horses lifted their heads as they arrived. He helped her down gently. "You can take your time. I will show you the room." Inside, the house smelled of pine and something faintly sweet, maybe honey or dried sage. The room he gave her was simple. A narrow bed with a quilt folded tight, a wash basin, a small chest of drawers. "I will fix supper," he said. "You rest as much as you need." She sat on the bed, her hands limp in her lap as he closed the door behind him. The quiet indoors was different, safer somehow. She pulled off her gloves, folded them neatly, and set them aside. When she came out later, the light had gone soft. Porter stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot. A loaf of bread sat on the table beside a jar of preserves. He turned when he heard her. "Hope you eat stew." "It is not much, but it is hot," she nodded. "Thank you." They ate in quiet again, but this time it was not heavy, just peaceful. When she set her spoon down, she looked at him fully. "You did not have to do this." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." Later, as she lay beneath the quilt, she listened to the wind in the trees and the hum of frogs down near the creek. She had been left in tears that morning, but tonight there was a roof over her head, a place to breathe, and the hand she had taken at the depot. It had not let go. The next days passed with slow healing. Sybil helped in the kitchen, fed the chickens, swept the porch. She found she liked the rhythm of the work. Porter never hovered, but he noticed everything. If her hands were chapped, he left a tin of salve by the wash basin. If she looked tired, he offered her a seat before she could ask. One morning, she stood on the porch watching the sun come up when he joined her, a mug of coffee in each hand. He passed her one. "You sleep all right," she nodded. "Better than I have in weeks." He looked out at the hills. "I was engaged once, long time ago. She took off before the wedding, said she was not made for ranch life." Sybil glanced at him. "I am sorry," he shrugged. "I reckon it worked out, still here," she smiled faintly. "You ever think about trying again?" He looked at her then. "I do now." Her heart thudded. The quiet between them deepened, not empty but full of something new, something waiting. By the third week, she had unpacked her bag. She did not plan to ask him anything she already had too much. But that night, as they sat under the stars with a lantern flickering between them, he reached over and took her hand. "I know this started wrong," he said. "You were supposed to meet someone else, but I do not want to see you leave." Sybil held his gaze. "I do not want to leave." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to move away. She did not. When his lips touched hers, it was soft and sure. And it felt like something had locked into place, not rushed, not forced, just right. The creek behind the house had risen with the spring melt, and Sybil stood knee-deep in the grass. Her skirt knotted at the side to keep it from dragging. A tin pail hung from one wrist, half full of early mushrooms she'd been taught to look for by a neighbor woman who passed by once a week with eggs to trade. The earth was damp beneath her shoes, and the scent of wet cottonwood bark mingled with something sharper. Oncoming rain, maybe. She heard Porter's boots before she saw him, the measured tread of someone not in a hurry, but always aware of where he was stepping. "You'll want to watch that far bank," he said as he came up beside her. "Ground gives out easy after a thaw." She looked up at him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wasn't planning to cross." "Good," he said. "I'd hate to fish you out." She handed him the pail. "Think these'll do?" He examined the contents, nodding once. "They'll cook up fine. I've got salt pork curing in the shed, might be a good supper." She walked beside him as they turned back toward the house, the pail swinging between his fingers. The clouds overhead had gathered thick and low, and wind pushed through the grass in slow, steady waves. "I've been thinking," she said, adjusting her shawl, "about staying on longer." Porter didn't answer right away. He kept walking, his eyes on the trail ahead. Then he said, "What would staying mean to you?" She considered that. "Not just a roof, not just safety, but a place where I can belong. Where I can make myself useful." His brow lifted slightly. "Useful's never been in question." They reached the porch, and he set the pail down carefully by the door. She waited, unsure for the first time since she'd stepped into his life. He looked at her, then stepped aside and held the door open. "You belong here if you want to," he said simply. That night, as she sliced mushrooms and he cut thick slabs from the salted meat, the silence between them was different, quiet, but humming with something unspoken. She had taken to wearing her sleeves rolled at the forearm, and he watched the way her hands moved with a kind of reverence, though he never said a word about it. After they ate, the sky opened up, and the rain came soft but steady against the roof. She stood by the window, watching the drops catch the lantern light, her arms folded loosely. Porter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You ever lived through a Nebraska summer storm?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I'm not afraid of thunder." He looked at her like he was seeing something deeper than her words. "That's good," he said. "Storms don't ask permission." She turned to face him. Neither did life. "But I'm still here." He stepped forward then, slowly, and reached out to tuck a damp strand of hair behind her ear. The fire crackled low behind him. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And you're kinder than most men I've known," she answered. He didn't kiss her that night. He didn't need to. The space between them was full of promise, and neither of them needed to rush what was already taking root in the quiet. The next morning, she woke to the smell of biscuits baking and the low sound of Porter humming as he swept out the kitchen. She stepped into the doorway and leaned against the frame, watching him. "I had a dream," she said. He looked up. "Good one. I was planting something, couldn't tell what, but I knew it would grow." He nodded once, the corner of his mouth pulling in thought. "Maybe you already are." Outside, the rain had passed and the land was shining. The wind had changed. Sybil noticed it first in the way the dry stalks near the well leaned eastward, then in the hush that came down over the house just before sunset. She stood by the root cellar with her skirts gathered in one hand, watching the sky turn the color of a tarnished coin. The air held a strange stillness, like the prairie was drawing breath. Porter stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a scrap of cloth. "We'll have weather tonight," he said, glancing up. Sybil nodded. "I felt it." He came to stand beside her, not saying more, just looking where she looked. His presence settled her unease in a way that had become quiet habit. She knew now how he moved through the world with patience, with care that didn't need words to announce itself. They worked together as the light faded, closing the shutters, bringing in the oil lamps. She laid out the quilts while he checked the door latches. The storm arrived after dark, all low thunder and hard rain that rattled the stovepipe. They didn't speak for a while, just listened from their chairs by the hearth. The flames threw long shadows across the floor, and the warmth of the fire reached her fingertips. Porter leaned back, his boot tapping gently against the hearthstone. "My father used to say lightning clears out what don't belong." Sybil looked over at him. "Did it work?" He gave a small shrug. Sometimes it just burned things." She folded her hands in her lap. "I used to be afraid of fire. When I was young, a neighbor's house caught. I remember the sky turning orange. I couldn't sleep for weeks after that." "You don't seem afraid now." "I'm not," she said. "Not anymore." He watched her for a moment like he was weighing something. Then he said, "You've taken to this place." "I have. Not just the land. I mean this life, the rhythm of it." She nodded. "It feels honest." That seemed to satisfy something in him. He rose to stoke the fire, adding a fresh log with practiced hands. She watched the way his shoulders moved, the way he crouched low and steady. His shirt was patched at one elbow but clean, the seams worn soft from years of washings. He didn't pretend at anything. That was what steadied her most. When the flames caught again, he turned back toward her and leaned against the mantel. "There's a clearing west of here, just beyond the ridge. Wild plums grow there come early summer. I thought I'd take the wagon out that way once the road dries." She tilted her head. "You go alone." "I used to." There was a quiet moment between them, not tense, just waiting. Then Sybil said, "I'd like to see it." He nodded once. "Then we'll go." The rain softened to a steady patter. She stood and crossed to the window, wiping a small circle in the fogged glass. Outside, the lantern on the barn swung gently in the wind. "You've lived here a long time," she said without turning. "But you don't speak much of your people, your kin. They're scattered. My brother died in Kansas, took a bullet over a fence line. My mother passed before the war. My father he left when I was a boy, didn't look back." She turned, her voice quiet. "That's a hard thing." He met her eyes. "It taught me to build what I could with my own hands and to hold on to what's worth keeping." She crossed the room and stopped in front of him. Her voice was steady. "I want to be part of what you're building." He didn't speak right away, just reached out and took her hand. His thumb brushed her knuckles, slow and certain. "You already are." The fire crackled behind them. She looked down at their joined hands. "I didn't expect to find anything out here," she said. "Not after everything." "Neither did I." He drew her gently toward him, his other hand resting at the small of her back, as if he'd been waiting all this time for the right moment to hold her like that. When their lips met, the kiss was quiet and sure. Like the rest of him, no firestorm, just warmth that stayed. She rested her forehead against his chest, and he stood still, steady beneath her. Outside, the storm passed over the ridge, leaving the sky clean behind it. And in that small house near the cottonwoods, something lasting had taken root. The road to the plum clearing was still soft in places, and the wagon's wheels left deep impressions in the damp soil as they creaked along. Sybil sat beside Porter on the bench seat, her hands folded in her lap, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. The scent of sun-warmed sage carried on the wind, and somewhere behind them, a meadowlark called. They hadn't spoken much since setting out, but the silence wasn't uneasy. Porter occasionally glanced her way, checking the trail ahead with the same quiet attention he gave everything. She had learned to read those glances, not searching, not uncertain. Just steady, like a man who knew the land beneath his boots and the woman beside him were both worth tending. As they reached a rise in the trail, he slowed the horses and pointed out across the horizon. "There," he said, "just past that stand of juniper. You'll see the trees when the sun catches their leaves." Sybil stood in the wagon bed for a better look. Her skirt brushed against the sideboard and the wind tugged at the ribbon under her chin. "It's greener than I thought it would be. Ground's richer out here," Porter said. "Old riverbed runs under it. Even in a dry year, it holds." She nodded, then stepped down with his help when they reached the clearing. The plums were just beginning to form small, hard bulbs wrapped in pale green skin, but the trees arched overhead like guardians, their branches thick with promise. Sybil walked among them, her fingers brushing the bark. "You ever bring anyone else out here?" "No," he said. She turned. "Why now?" Porter leaned a shoulder against the wagon's wheel. "Because this place grows best when it's shared." She moved toward him slowly, her boots pressing into the soft earth. "I want to plant something here, something that'll last past just one season." He looked up at her, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. "What did you have in mind?" "A row of sunflowers. Maybe some herbs along the fence line if we put one in." He nodded. "We can do that." She smiled, a quiet curve of her mouth. "Then let's start tomorrow." Before they left, she knelt and pressed her palm into the ground. When she stood, there was dirt on her skirt and under her nails, and she didn't mind it at all. That evening, they returned to the house with the late light stretching long across the field. Porter unhitched the horses while Sybil carried the baskets inside, empty for now, but filled with plans. Once the chores were done, they sat beside the stove with 2 mugs of chicory brew. Porter rolled a small cedar twig between his fingers, his gaze thoughtful. "You ever think about building something more permanent out here?" he asked. Sybil looked up. "More than a garden," he nodded. "A second room, maybe a porch that runs the length of the house, space for what comes next, whatever that ends up being." She set her mug down. "You mean for us?" "Yes," he said. "I do." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Then I think it's time we talk about what that future looks like." He didn't draw back. "I've never asked a woman for her hand not proper, but I'd like to now." Sybil's voice was soft but sure. "Then ask." He cleared his throat, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Would you be my wife, Sybil? Would you stay here, build this life with me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, I want to be yours." His shoulders eased, and she saw the weight lift from him like dust shaken from a coat. He stood and came around the table, drawing her up into his arms with a care that made her breath catch. As they held each other in the quiet, the wind moved through the cottonwoods outside, and the last light of day slipped through the window, catching in her hair. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. What had begun in sorrow was now rooted in something far stronger. And come morning, they would rise together with tools in hand and hearts steady, ready to build what neither of them had dared hope for before: a home, a life. A promise kept. The day of their wedding dawned with a clear sky and the scent of damp earth rising from the fields. Sybil stood inside the house, pressing down the creases of her modest cream dress with careful hands. It had belonged to a neighbor's sister, worn only once before, and had been gifted to her without fuss or pity. She'd mended the hem herself, stitching each thread with quiet purpose. Porter waited outside, brushing dust from his jacket sleeve as he checked the horses. He wore the same black coat he'd worn to the county stock auction the year before, the one with a patch behind one shoulder and silver thread along the cuffs that caught the light. He had shaved that morning, and his jaw, usually rough with stubble, was smooth and sun-darkened. They married beneath the cottonwood tree near the creek, the same one that had stood silent through every change of season since Porter's father planted it past 50 years ago. The justice rode out from Red Rock on a borrowed mule, and the ceremony was short. No guests beyond the older couple from the adjoining land, who brought a crock of sweet beans and a tin of biscuits wrapped in a flour sack. Sybil didn't cry. She held Porter's hands as if they were the only solid thing in the world, and when he said her name with the word wife beside it, her chest filled with something so steady it felt like breath itself had changed shape. Afterward, they sat together on the porch steps, her bare feet tucked beneath her skirt, his arm resting behind her without needing to pull her close. The wind moved through the tall grass, and the sun began to dip low, casting a golden light across the road that led nowhere but home. Porter glanced over. "You nervous?" "No," Sybil said. "Not even a little." He nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "I was." She looked at him, surprised. "Not about you," he said. "About deserving this, having something good stay." "You do," she said. "You always did." She leaned into his side, her head resting against his shoulder, and they sat there until the sky turned violet. The house behind them was small, the land sometimes harsh, but it belonged to them now as much as they belonged to each other. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the days lengthened. The sunflower seeds she planted along the fence sprouted slender and green, and Porter built her a bench beneath the plum trees, using cedar boards cured in the barn rafters. She read aloud to him some evenings from the one book she'd carried from Ohio, her voice soft under the low light of the oil lamp. He carved a new yoke for the oxen and taught her how to mend harness leather. One afternoon, she stood barefoot in the kitchen, rolling dough while the windows stood open to the breeze. Porter came in with dust on his boots and news of a neighbor's calf born breech but living. "I told them you knew how to make a poultice for the afterbirth strain," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'll ride over before sundown," she said, brushing flour from her hands. As he crossed the room, he caught her around the waist and kissed the side of her neck, his lips brushing warm against her skin. "I like coming home to you," he said. "You always will," she answered. The seasons turned. The plums ripened and the porch filled with jars of jam sealed in wax. The fields gave up what they could, and what they couldn't, they did without. There was no extravagance, only the deep comfort of shared labor, the kind that made a bed feel warmer at night and a morning start with purpose. They never spoke of the man who left her stranded at Red Rock. There was no need. That story had ended the moment she'd taken Porter's hand, years past. The house grew by one room, then two. The porch stretched wider, and Porter built a swing from hemp rope and oak slats. Sybil's hair grew long and silvered at the edges, and Porter's steps slowed. But his hands never forgot their strength. Children from nearby farms came to sit on her porch when they scraped their knees or needed a place to wait out a storm. She taught them how to read their names and mend seams, and Porter showed them how to tell the time by the sun. They never had children of their own, but their life was full. Full of days that ended with firelight, nights that began with a kiss. Full of seasons marked by harvests and new foals, and the long, quiet knowledge that no matter what came, they would face it side by side. One late summer evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields burned gold, Porter took Sybil's hand while they sat beneath the plum trees. "I never thought peace would look like this," he said. She turned to him, her voice steady. "I did, the moment you said I could stay." He kissed her then, slow and sure, the same way he had that first night, only now with all the years behind it. She leaned into him, and the wind moved through the trees above, carrying the scent of ripe fruit and warm earth. The farmhouse stood strong behind them. The fences held. The sunflowers leaned tall and bright along the edge of the road. And in that quiet, golden light, there was nothing left uncertain. They had built a life. They had built it together, and it would last.